The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, and so does a new episode of Through the Glass Columns, your weekly read-along Wheel of Time podcast, which, we could pretend this is the first week just because it feels a little more official when we actually get the language. But you are joining us today for week 2 of book 9, which is, of course, Winter's Heart, and today we will be discussing chapters 1, 2, and 3. That's right, it's a bonus. And spoiler, you get a bonus next week too, because we got some pretty short chapters to start this off. So today we'll be discussing chapter 1, Leaving the Prophet, chapter 2, Taken, and chapter 3, Customs. Joining me, as always, whoever I am, because I didn't say my name, it's Tyler. Tyler, how's it going?
It's going very well. I have to say, I often kind of evaluate these weeks based on how long my notes are. And my notes are short this week, especially for a 3-chapter week. I'm kind of curious what all we have to say here. I'm not saying these were bad chapters. I actually enjoyed quite a few things that happened in them. But this is a moment where I'm like, oh, is the slog still going on? Because it does feel like we read 3 kind of catch-up chapters. Not a whole lot new felt like it moved forward.
I will generally agree with that and say it was a little surprising how much the first one felt a little montagey in a way that chapters often aren't. But then if you leave aside that sequence, then it felt like, hey, remember Perrin and Faile? They used to be in these books. Let's talk a little bit about them. And it was nice to return to those characters. They were very slimly present in the last book, right? They weren't entirely gone, but it's been a while.
They actually got a solid 5-6 chapters, but it was all at the very, very beginning of the book. And then they had, like you're saying, just at the very end, they popped in for the epilogue, and that was pretty much it. So, this is a return to these characters after quite some time. And then I think the thing that surprised me is I wanted it to be a bigger explosion, right? Like when something monumental like Faile getting captured at the end of the last book happens, I want to kind of see things in action. And I don't know that we quite got that. We'll dive into details in a moment. But what was your overall kind of takeaway from these chapters? As you say, it kind of feels like the official start of the book.
Yeah. We have an ongoing joke in my household where I pet the dog and I say, oh my God, you're the best dog in the world. I love you so much. You're such a special dog. And then my wife looks over at us and says, you're fine. And so I felt like this is, hey, Wheel of Time, you're fine. You're not the best dog in the world with these 3 chapters. You're just fine.
That sounds accurate. Let's begin with the first of the 3 just fine chapters, Leaving the Prophet. And as someone who teaches a bunch of economics and business, profit with an E instead of an I is still weird. It looks wrong. A wind blows, and Tanchico is under Shanshan rule, and a fleet of ordinary people have arrived, providing new farmers and new workers in a variety of industries. The locals don't seem to mind much, as the chaos of civil war has abated. In Amador, however, they are handling Shanshan rule much less well, and there seems to be discontent. It's noted that the children of the light who are still around are in chains. We then switch to Perrin's POV, who leaves Mazima's, noting that all of the guards are zealots. Elias says he didn't think he thought that they would have to fight their way out, and Perrin says the fact that they didn't is the only thing that went right. Perrin doubts that they can stealthily get all of the way to Rand with Mazima, and Elias suggests an impossible plan, but we don't get to find out exactly what it is. Perrin is distracted thinking of Faile when Cyanid, one of the Aes Sedai, asks if he agrees that Mazima must be killed. They eventually agree to discuss it away from Mazima's guards, and they ride off. Perrin studies Aram, who Elias says only believes in the sword and Perrin, and that's not enough. As they are making their way out of the city, Perrin notes that Abila is full of hungry rabble, and then Balwer arrives with news of interest. First, that the Amadisian army has been defeated by the Shanshan, and that the White Cloaks participated but escaped. And second, the Shanshan lost a battle against Channelers outside of Ibudar. Perrin says this is good news, and Balwer begins to study him carefully. So boy, is this a catch-up chapter. What did we think about leaving the Prophet?
Yeah, I mean, what's funny is I do think that the kind of return to the wind and all that now is feeling kind of really nice to me as a reader. And I found myself, and this probably speaks exactly to my age, I found myself picturing the way a certain era of Disney animated movie always opened with the book. They've recreated that. I think Frozen did it more recently, but there's like a classic era like Winnie the Pooh, Robin Hood, that kind of era that hit VHS when I was a kid. And I find myself kind of picturing that as these words come on. It's the book is kind of slowly opening up and seeing the title page. And then what's funny about that in this case is then it's essentially a map page. It's like, hey, here's a map and here's what's going on that map. So I enjoyed that kind of bit of experience. I mean, if I have a singular takeaway, it's that the Sean Chan, if we thought they were beaten last book, they are not. They are stronger than ever. They are ascendant, and to the fact that they are now actively colonizing the continent, which is pretty exciting and cool. But again, it's like, it's not that I thought that plot was over, but I was much more interested in Rand getting to some of his other to-do list, and it's like, oh, this is going to be a big problem now.
Yeah, and I think the idea that especially it seems like some of the common folk are actually like buying into the Sean Chan ascendancy, that feels like the moment that's really worrisome for Rand, right? It's one thing if there are like two sides of the conflict and Rand can kind of be the one representing this side of the ocean, but as soon as it feels like the common folk are accepting the Sean Chan, that narrative really changes, and I start to worry about, how is he actually going to pull this many people out, right? Once there's colonizers, as you're saying, there's common people who need to be removed if you want to get rid of all of the Sean Chan influence, and that seems like a big deal, and I can't believe I'm saying this with only, 5 more mainline books left for him to deal with this problem. Like, it feels like we're getting closer to the end when we talk about big problems like this.
Yeah, I definitely had that feeling too, that I think I even said in our wrap up of the last book, like it feels like we're done adding problems and we're now checking them off. And this is somewhere right in the middle of those two. This isn't really a new problem, but you're right that the presence of civilians makes this a much different problem in terms of interacting with that. And it also becomes clear that it's seemingly the people are like, hey, you know what? The Sean Chan, they keep the trains running on time. They keep everything on schedule. Like, it's not so bad. And, we've certainly been exposed around the continent to a lot of places where high lords exploit the lesser people. And so, and I think in some of the moments that appealed to me more, that's what Game of Thrones did pretty well, was be like, yeah, guess what? And the common people hate all of them, right? Like, the Game of Thrones doesn't matter when you just want to plant a crop and feed your family. And so I think there's going to be something more to that. And, as always, when I find myself thinking a lot about something in Game of Thrones, I'm immediately that's backwards, right? I should, clearly George R.R. Martin was friends with Robert Jordan, was, into this book series and took the influence. So it's always well, maybe these are just glimpses of things he borrowed from his friend, not the other way around.
Well, and it's always interesting, right? Because that can be both borrowed and emphasized in a way that Robert Jordan didn't quite get to, right? And I think that's kind of where I'm at with a lot of this is, if we're going to be introducing our 87th POV character and have, Ciane in the White Tower, I would rather have someone who represents these kind of, common people and see how they respond to all of these changes in power. And we don't get it, right? So even though the influence might be flowing in George R.R. Martin's direction, let's also give him credit. He executed it more effectively than I think Robert Jordan has, at least thus far in the series. I then want to kind of turn our attention to Perrin and kind of this vast, group that is following him now, right? There's a lot of names that could be easily forgotten. There's a lot of kind of factions that we're dealing with, and we're introduced to at least many of them in this chapter. So let's run through a few of these. Number 1, Mazima is a name that we should be getting familiar with. That is the Prophet of the Dragon. We also have Elias, who I hope you remember. Wolfman is a warder. And then the ones that...
Spoken as if my name tonight on our Zoom chat is not Wolfie Greg. That's in honor of Elias. Thank you very much.
I mean, that is both in honor of Elias and could have been an indication you didn't remember Elias's name. He's just Wolfie Greg to you now. So, I think that the only other one that I wanted to mention is Cyanid, and I didn't write down her friend's name. There are two Aes Sedai with Perrin, and they get what I think is the most interesting note in this section, which is them basically saying, like, so you saw it, right? Mazima needs to die. And that is not the position that I kind of expected from the Aes Sedai who want to position themselves as, like, Perrin's advisor or something along those lines. So I'm curious your take on the group as a whole that Perrin is interacting with, but especially these bloodthirsty Aes Sedai.
I mean, it felt a little bit like the microcosm of Rand's coalition. Like, Rand is just trying to keep all these pieces together, as we talked about all last book, and now Perrin has to do that kind of in more perilous stakes, that he's both closer to the front of these battles. I know Rand was literally on the front for some time, but he's mostly back in his cities. And here, like, he now has a very serious objective, and he needs this team to actually work together. So it's also like a weird kind of X-Men group of very disparate powers in fun ways. And so I don't know why I went to X-Men. I guess it makes sense. Yeah, we'll go with X-Men. But I'm looking forward to this mission. And I guess the question that comes into my mind is like, okay, is this going to be like quick, we chase him down, we kill some Shido, and we get Faile back? Or what I suspect is that we're going to spend a long time kind of doing the Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli chasing, tracking kind of across a whole book to get Merry and Pippin back.
You think Perrin's going to break his foot for real and it's going to make its way into the cut of the movie? That's what you're saying?
If only weird dudes like us can point it out every time we watch it with someone new, then they do it.
I want to then talk a little bit about Aram, who Elias specifically calls out here as only believing in his sword and Perrin, and that's not enough. And we obviously don't see Aram do anything, but that description of him and the number of times that a tinker with a sword came up in our prophecy discussion a couple of weeks ago when we finished the last book, I feel like I at least need to get your feelings on where we're at with Aram at this point.
Not a character I think that much about, so the thoughts are thin. Like, I haven't. I mean, that's a really interesting warning, and I do think, when we think of Rand, we think much more about a like cult of personality. I mean, we're dealing with the Prophet, who hasn't even really been near Rand, but is like trading in the cult of personality about Rand. And you would imagine that all the Taviran could have that effect on people. So here we have somebody who is essentially signing up for the Perrin cult of personality. But the idea that, Robert Jordan through Elias is signaling like that's not enough, that's compelling.
So at this point, Balwer arrives, and we get news of two sets of battles. So one of them is news to us, which is that the Amadisian army attacked the Shanshan and apparently was more or less destroyed, but the Weight Cloaks were able to get away from that battle. The second update, I'm fairly confident in saying this is the events of the previous book, Rand's campaign against the Shanshan. We learned that the Shanshan were more or less pushed back to Ibu Dar. That's really interesting from the perspective of Perrin and where he's positioned, because the battle is going badly for the Shanshan further from him, but the loss of the Amadisian army actually means that they kind of have a straight path towards where Perrin and Faile currently are. So we kind of want to be keeping an eye on the state of the Shanshan in the area that Perrin is in at the moment.
Well, and bracketed within that, I'm flipping to my map just to double check, that does kind of open up a path towards the two rivers. We have a mountain range, but there are some gaps in that mountain range. So if kind of if they were pushed back kind of northeast of Abu Dar, that actually kind of pushes them more towards the Amadisian force, and they can just come swoop through where Perrin is and head into what I still think of as like the Shire. Like we want to protect that more than anything, even if it's not strategically significant. So, I read that the same way that it's like, oh, look, he read the last book, or this guy read the last book and reported in. But I also, my thoughts about the common folk, that was part of what was inspired with this Amadician army, because the scout is very clearly like, hey, all the high lords win and there are no high lords, so guess that Shan Chan just own this place now. Yeah. And it again is like making me ask, like, well, maybe we should try to earn the common people's respect, and maybe the high lords were terrible. I mean, we've mostly seen terrible high lords, not like beneficent, wonderful, great rulers. So I don't know. Is this just me reading the 2026 Eat the Rich kind of attitude into it, perhaps? But yeah, eat the rich.
You're not wrong. This chapter has its own counterpoint to that, though. It's like, look, if we don't have high lords, what we have instead is madmen with armies of zealots. Like, it feels like it's all bad is how this kind of plays out for the common folk, which, eat the rich. Any last thoughts on this chapter before we move on to the next one?
Well, I mean, we didn't really talk about what Perrin is doing in the title of the chapter, right? So am I right? His mission is to go get the prophet and take the prophet to Rand. Is that essentially the goal until Faile shows, or the news of Faile arrives?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe that's not worth having said, but to note that, again, if we're listing all the threats, as I understood, the prophet seemed largely harmless, like a minor despot. It's actually kind of like Star Wars does with their little imperial warlords. Yeah. It's like, oh, here's a guy who has manipulated people to have some false power, and Rand's gonna pull him in. But the fact that it's like, no, you need to get him and bring him in. It's like, oh, maybe this is more of a big deal than I thought. That. It felt like one of those false dragon stories, like, oh, there's like a guy, he's doing a thing, like we should probably check in on that. But this one seems to have elevated in terms of its intensity.
Yeah, I think partially probably just because Mazima actually knows Rand, and so like Rand feels more responsible for it. But I think you're right to be putting Mazima at that like mid-level boss kind of thing, right? He's not, continent shaking the way that Rand or the Shan Chan are, but he's a big enough deal that I think you're right to note that Perrin isn't taking the most direct route possible. He's letting Mazima take his time and plan a little bit, and as the chapter title says, leaving the prophet feels like an odd choice for someone who is supposed to lead the prophet somewhere.
So he is like Bowser Jr. or one of those weird Bowsers that's in a castle. Whereas we're most of the time dealing with just straight up Koopas. Like,
I just need to point out that I was recently at the Nintendo store in Tokyo, and they have plushies for every single one of the Bowser Juniors or whatever, and I loved it so much. I think that's a good place to say, let's then talk about Chapter 2, Taken, which sadly does not star Liam Neeson. Perrin approaches his camp where the Gaul Dinin are in a standoff with some of the Two Rivers men. He approaches Berelain, who reports that Faile has been taken. They cannot search with small parties because of the numbers of the Shido, and Perrin orders they do everything they can and stews while watching all of the people in the camp debate about what can be done. Perrin reaches out to the wolves, but they cannot help because they don't distinguish between different groups of humans. Arganda, who is the head of Aleandre's army, is in a panic because Aleandra has been taken, but Perrin demands to know why his soldiers seem ready for battle, and it basically boils down to him being racist against the Aiel. Perrin orders that Arganda have his men stand down, and he eventually does. Berelain commends Perrin for the way that he handled that, and Perrin tells her to stop playing games with Faile being captive, and she gives at best a dismissive answer. Perrin then approaches the Two Rivers folk and orders that they prepare to move out, and when they ask, and then he sees Gaul and asks that he and the Maidens of the Spear try to find Faile. Perrin is surprised to see Gaul leading the group of Aiel, thinking that normally the Maidens make sure that he is not the one in command. As night begins to fall, Grady approaches him, asking for how he can help with the search, but Perrin instead tells him to be ready to move out. Perrin approaches one of the Wise Ones to ask how Faile will be treated,
but she says that taking wetlanders is against custom, so she cannot say how the captives will be treated. She then tells him to stay rational, seeming to think that men are not able to do so typically. He oversees the packing of the camp, and Linny brings him dinner, and Perrin promises that he will get Magdan back. Perrin then sees Talonvor waiting for the scouts to return, and silently decides to wait with him. So no one is told that Perrin has a special set of skills, but we're on the path to that potentially happening. What did you think of Taken?
I mean, you listed so many names just now, and I will say this is where my notes are much thinner for the second and third, and so really to me it just seems like, okay, Perrin is very aware that Faile has been taken and needs to kind of set a plan in action. We get a little kind of preview of what kind of leader he is, and yet then we see him kind of somewhat breaking his own rules to be like, but Faile is what really matters here. And, in a kind of classic trope of I'm married to my job, except for that woman I'm actually married to, then I'm going to actually save her first. And so then all the tiny little dynamics of, Gaul's more in charge and so on, like I registered them and you just articulated them again. But it really didn't feel like any of them mattered to me. It's like, let's get the Aiel running as fast as you can. I mean, maybe the character moment I love the most is when Gaul is like, whatever this stuff is, and is like kicking snow off his feet. The fact that you would not know what snow is but immediately hate it registered with me after the winter we've had.
Yeah, as someone who taught a lot of students from like California and Florida who would have their first winters when they were in my class, watching students go from like, it's so pretty to why is it happening again is one of the joys of being a college professor. I think you're right to say that this is kind of a chapter that's about Perrin like showing he's a decent leader and then just listing all of the people who are going to be a challenge to him being a leader. So I kind of feel like we maybe just take this like individual by individual so that we kind of get a chance to talk about everyone whose name we need to remember. Unfortunately, that means the first one I need to mention is Berylane, who seems to just be plowing ahead with flirting with Perrin while his wife is captive. What do we think here?
Yeah, I mean, it still feels like we fell backwards into this plot line, but like it has just continued ticking away in exactly how you would expect it to. Like flirty, flirty, flirty. We're a thing, even though they don't seem like they were ever a thing.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I will say Berylane is competent, right? It would be very easy to write this as like a character who only knows how to get her way via her sexuality, but she actually makes really good points about the military advisability of scouting for the Shido and how many they have versus how many scouts would be required. Like, she knows what she's doing. She just also knows what she's doing when it comes to ruining marriages. So, good on her for being balanced. Next individual is one that we haven't really experienced at all before. Arganda is the head of Aleandre's army, and he seems very upset that Aleandre has been taken, but that's all I got. Remember the name Arganda. Anything to say about this dude?
No. Apologies if that siren that just buzzed by my house was audible, dear listeners. I assume that was, now I've already forgotten his name, Arganda on his way to an emergency.
Yep. Good job remembering a name 6 seconds later. You got this. Next up is Grady. So we had Nield mentioned in the previous chapter. We have Grady in this one. It's worth noting that Perrin has 2 Ashaman with him, and both of them seem interested and like involved, and Perrin shuts each of them down in turn, and they just take it as an order. They don't push back at all. So I know that the Ashaman, I'm kind of lumping a couple of them together, but seeing a character other than Rand interact with them, I find very interesting. Any thoughts on these 2 characters?
Not really. I mean, again, I feel like I wasted my key point early, which is like, it's just hard to manage. These are such different people with such different ideas of what power should be. So you look at a Berylane versus an Ashaman. It's like, how do you like even conceive that these are the same species?
Next, I want to talk about Gaul, which I think there is something going on here. So Gaul apparently normally has to take a back seat to the Maidens of the Spear, but Gaul is allowed to lead in the search for Faile, which I think notably is also the search for Bane and Chiad, and we know that Gaul is in love with, I think, Bane, but Chiad doesn't like him, so Bane won't be with him unless Chiad will also be with him. Something along those lines. I might have Bane and Chiad flipped there. So I think the fact that Gaul is allowed to lead is probably an indication that the maidens are kind of taking this as like him searching for his lost love, and they're kind of letting him kind of take the lead out of pity for having lost Bane and Chiad.
I did not remember any of that, so I'm glad you repeated it and rehearsed it for me. Yeah, I mean, I think, as I've confessed before, I yield power dynamics don't interest me too much, but I will say that I clocked that Gaul was being given a field promotion essentially, and he's certainly capable, and he's certainly like. Again, we're kind of in a part of the map he would know pretty well compared to some other parts of the map, relatively speaking. So it kind of all made sense. So I didn't necessarily bump on that kind of emotional like state of it. But look, I mean, my kind of vague impression of Gaul is like really capable dude. And so when Perrin in particular is like, you're going to be the one who goes to find Faile, I was like, yeah, done. Like, makes sense. Like, my wife gets kidnapped, I'm going to send, like, most capable dude around. Sorry, Tyler, you're not getting a call.
That is valid.
I'm calling Liam Neeson and sending Liam Neeson.
Yeah, Gaul should be played by Liam Neeson. You are correct. That is an accurate representation. We then get Perrin talking to the Wise Ones, and he basically asked them, like, what are the rules here? How is Faile going to be treated? And their response is the Shido are already breaking the rules by taking her, so we don't know what other rules they would break. We can't tell you what the conditions will be like. And that is both really direct and candid and not an answer at all. And I was kind of interested in how the Wise Ones answer all of Perrin's questions, but don't seem to feel like they're under any obligation to give the best answer or a full answer. They're kind of answering the way that serves them.
Checks out, and maybe I get distracted blowing a thread off my notes when I should have been listening more. But
that's
checks
okay.
out.
Wise ones be wise ones. The last note that we get is Linny is upset but handling it well. Talonvor is upset and handling it by sitting in the snow, which doesn't seem like the healthiest approach. We know that they are grieving the loss of Morgaze, and no one else knows it's Morgaze, but any thoughts on Perrin's servants and their reaction to the missing women?
I thought of the Good Place move of just putting your head in your hoodie and pulling the strings all the way down. That's what he's doing, right?
That's 100% accurate. Any last thoughts about Taken before we dive into our final chapter, which it's worth noting doesn't have a new chapter icon, but has a chapter icon we haven't seen in like 5 books. So feel free to look at that beautiful falcon.
Well, I will say no more notes on that chapter, and I did actually clock that. I sat down and I was to read this chapter, and I was like, wait, I don't know that this is one we see regularly. And I wasn't texting you to ask if it was one we had to talk about, so I guess I can't claim I thought it might be new. So I must have known that it was familiar. But it is a beautiful falcon.
Good job taking credit for something that you kind of vaguely thought that was confirmed after the fact.
Laziness transformed into insight.
Oh, white male privilege to think that thinking a thought means that you deserve credit. I do it all the time. Chapter 3, Customs. Faile worries about freezing and Perrin's political problems somehow to distract herself. She wonders how she might use the weather to escape, but is quickly overwhelmed just keeping up from falling and being manhandled by Roland every time that she does trip. After she becomes exhausted, Roland begins carrying her through the snow over his shoulder, and it seems that Eliandre and Magdin are even worse for wear, but seem to be hanging on. The Cha Faile captives model Bane and Chiad's stoicism, which Faile thinks is good, although it makes it more difficult for him to evaluate their condition. When lifted, Alejandre and Magdan fight until Faile tells them not to, but they are punished, of course, by spanking. It's Robert Jordan, before they are then carried over the shoulder. Faile fights pain to look at her followers and check on their condition, and she thinks of Perrin to fight the exhaustion. Soon it is morning, and she wakes up to tea. She is in pain and frozen, but notes that all of her followers are still alive. Roland explains that by giving them blankets, they have shamed them because they are not wearing white of the guy Shane, but they have been given clothes before they have fully been taken captive. Roland is apparently a Meridin, who he refers to as brotherless, and then Faile notes the size of the camp that she is in. It may be hundreds of thousands of Shido. Faile asks how she can trust that the Shido will free her after a year and a day, and Roland doesn't have a good answer to that. Faile sets herself to planning how she's going to escape because she no longer trusts that she will be released at any point. So, this is a good check-in with Faile. What did we take away from customs?
I mean, my notes are Shido marching captives, Faile reacting. And that's the bulk of what happens here. But I will go a little broader than that and just say that I do respect this chapter because it is trying to make it clear that this is not a damsel in distress, right?
Yeah.
The classic Princess Leia formulation is this is a distressed damsel, which I don't know it quite applies here, but what's clear is that she's still capable and she's still herself, and to literally not just be sitting in a tent waiting to be rescued, but to showing leadership of checking in on her people and doing the kind of calculations of what's going on around her. I thought they maintained that so that this plot that I assume is necessary for larger motions doesn't, I mean, I guess I can say doesn't fridge her, right? I'm never sure of that
Assuming
that phrasing. Presumably, right? Like
that would probably
sacrifice
be
her. Yeah, sacrifice her to tell a better story about a male character.
So I think that the interesting thing here is both, as you're saying, how essential this chapter is. I think you're right to say we need Faile not to vanish into the background. We need her to continue to be the kind of, proactive, aggressive character that we've seen in the past. But literally nothing happens in this chapter. Faile runs through the snow and then is carried through the snow and then checks on her friends and then runs through the snow. Like, I don't have much to say here other than we seem to have an interesting dynamic emerging between Faile and Roland. There are moments here where it almost feels like a meet cute, and then other moments where it's very clearly not that. What's your take on this new character we've been introduced to?
And forgive my poor memory, we did know before that it was the Shido who had taken her, or is this
correct?
So we did know that from the last chapter. I couldn't remember if that had been revealed or if she was just taken by like masked people. Yeah, I mean, look, the gold standard of this, and I'm not taking questions at this time, is Belloc and Marion from Raiders of the Lost Ark, and like this needs to do a lot to get to that level, but there's like a tiny little glimmer of like, what if this is kind of a game recognized game, a meeting of two leaders within these kind of silly confines. So I see a glimmer of something that could become a character beat that's interesting with Roland, but I'm not ready to endorse it as can't wait to see more, because it doesn't feel like this is the half of this plot that matters.
First off, just because I scratched out like 6 D's in my notes, it's Roland, not Roland. Okay. The other thing I want to note about Roland before we kind of move on to other concerns is that at the end of the chapter, we learn that Roland is Meridin, which Faile translates as meaning brotherless, but she doesn't know what that means. However, we do. So the brotherless are individuals who have been broken by Rand's revelation of the Aiel's original sin, that they used to be pacifists, and so they have chosen to give up on Aiel society writ large. And so, strictly speaking, Roland is not Shido. He was probably from one of the other 11 clans, and then when he became brotherless, the Shido were the only ones who he kind of attached himself to and not be held to the old standards. So he is kind of in an interesting position as being very clearly having abandoned Rand's side in the Aiel conflict, but maybe not necessarily wholeheartedly agreeing with the Shido's willingness to disregard a lot of the old customs. So any thoughts on how that changes your perspective of this character?
It makes it more interesting, right? Like, actually, kind of sounds like Belloc. I'm interested to see a little bit more. I think I am more compelled by characters driven by their ideology than their like, I don't know. I was gonna say they're hereditary, but it's not. Tribes in Aiel aren't really hereditary, or kind of. They're more communities than anything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if that's what we've got for Roland, then the other big update here is Faile barely makes it, Aleandre and Magdan barely make it, Bane and Chiad make it. Like, there's a lot of interesting, like, Magdan is the one who fights the hardest, or like little details like that. But I think the big takeaway here is all of the characters who were taken are now prisoner, and let's see what happens to them in future chapters.
Sounds good. Will do.
So I guess my question for you is something you alluded to at the beginning of this discussion, but I kind of want to use the jumping off point from the end of this chapter for Faile, right? Which is, she seems convinced that there is no kind of this ends on its own possibility. She immediately doubts the idea that the Shido will ever release them, even if she does manage to make it a full year. So what do you see this plot line being? We've now had 3 chapters of setup for it after it was kind of initially established in the end of the previous book. Are you seeing this as being like a quick detour? Are you seeing this as being like a multi-book? Like, what are we dealing with, I guess, in your mind as you read these 3 chapters?
I mean, I'll liken it back to what I said with the beginning of The Two Towers, which the film The Two Towers, which is actually one book within the book Two Towers, if I remember how those are constructed. Where you have Merry and Pippin being dragged away, and the 3 hero characters. I guess I'm not letting Merry and Pippin be heroes, but you have the 3 more heroic characters chasing them down, and so it feels kind of like a plot like this. It kind of feels like a 1 book size plot, but I was just thinking even before you turned it into a question that, like, I don't see Rand getting involved in this. Like, this doesn't reach his desk, right? This is like supposed to be taken care of by lieutenants and so on. And I don't know that I really see Gaul and the maidens solving this either. So I guess I maybe will just extend the Two Towers comparison and say I kind of imagine they will blunder their way into a new plot, and they'll all kind of reunite within that new plot, whatever it may be. Maybe an Entmoot. Who knows?
It's probably an Entmoot. I think,
or I guess I should have gone with, or they'll stumble into Moraine coming back, right? Which would fit with Gandalf the White. They'll run into Moraine the White first.
No, Entmoot is the better joke. I'm sorry that your other idea actually fit better. I'll be totally honest. I don't have notes about what to talk about with this chapter. It's like Faile runs through snow. Any last thoughts before we preview next week?
I'll beat you to it. So as I said at the opening of the episode, we're going to do 3 chapters again. This, listeners, was a borderline case, but as I think we've already used as our excuse, whenever we hear from some of you, it's we don't care, we'll go at our own pace, we can always pause the episode. So we're going to bundle together the next 3 chapters. So that's Chapter 4, Offers, Chapter 5, Flags, and Chapter 6, Scent of Madness. Man, there's a like Washington D.C. joke about all 3 of those. That's what we got, and I don't know. I'm not there yet.
I was gonna go 80s erotic thrillers, but yeah, both of those work.
So we are excited to read those and continue on this journey. And I think we've also alluded to this is a little longer than last time, but not dramatically longer than the last book. So it feels to me really good to start with a giant prologue and then do these 2-3 chapter weeks, it's like, yeah, we're moving now and we're cooking. And hopefully you're all enjoying this as you slide into your summers, whatever that looks like. And you can take the Robert Jordan book with you to a beach or a hotel somewhere, or just your tea ride to continue going to work, whatever the case may be. Tyler, what's our podcast called?
Through the Glass Columns.